Social influence, part 2. We've read how social influence occurs in many different forms. Influences can come from a person, a group, or an institution. It can be constructive, destructive, or have no impact. The three forms of social influence are conformity, compliance, and obedience. Social impact theory addresses the common bond between the various social influences. Additionally, group processes are affected by various social influences. In the following slides, we will discuss each of these topics. Conformity is the tendency of individuals to change their perceptions, opinions, or behaviors to match group norms. People conform primarily for the desire to be right and the fear of ostracism. The desire to be right or informational influence occurs when people believe that if others agree it must be so. They must be correct. And this is an example of this would be looking at the reviewer ratings for a product on Amazon, looking for those stars to make sure that you're buying a product that's good. Fear of ostracism is when people fear that nonconformity could lead to rejection by a group. This can actually cause a social pain that feels like physical pain. There are two types of conformity. There's private conformity, which is truly changing your beliefs, conversion, and actually changing your heart and your mind. And there's public conformity. This is when you superficially change your behaviors only on the outside. And I believe our text gave an example of politicians may do this. Additional factors that have influence include group size. As the group size increases, conformity increases. However, research has found that past the presence of only 3 to 4 others, that the conformity increase is minimal. Norms can also increase conformity, but only if they are known and focused upon. The presence of an ally or having a partner in the dissent can influence. It's harder to stand alone than to stand with even one other person, so any dissent can reduce normative pressure to conform. In the article that we read this week by Rees and Wallace, the research they did on adolescence and drinking, they studied the group norm related to adolescent social influence, looking at the impact of a minority influence on friend groups where the majority of the friends drink. And their research found that non-drinking friends in the minority can decrease the odds of a non-drinker drinking, even in the presence of the majority. So obviously the presence of an ally can actually reduce that pressure to conform. And finally, gender. Now, conformity is usually based on how comfortable people are with a task instead of gender difference. However, when people have a conflict face-to-face, women are more likely than men to conform if they feel like they're being observed. Compliance. People tend to conform in certain situations to match group norms or expectations. Direct request may also cause people to change their behaviors. Often we do this without even thinking. Mindlessly we comply. The example that was given in the book that I found interesting was where an experimenter tried to make copies and stood in line behind several people to do that these people complied 93% of the time when he just asked to step ahead of the others by saying he needed to make copies. So obviously needing to make copies was not a legitimate reason to step in front of other people, but yet we mindlessly comply because our brains are not processing it. We're kind of on automatic pilot. The norm of reciprocity also is a form of compliance. When someone has done something for us, such as buy us a Coke, we feel like we need to buy them a Coke in return. There are also traps that can cause us to comply, and these are sequential request techniques. The ones that were mentioned in our text this week include foot in the door, where a requester makes a small request to which the participant complies, and then comes in and says, but there's a larger request. Lowballing. Now, the example used in the textbook was car salesman. With this technique, something is presented, a good or a service, that initially gets commitment from an individual on the request, only for the person presenting to come back and increase the request by revealing hidden costs. Door in the face. This is almost opposite of the lowball request. A requester makes an initial request that is large, so large to be turned down, and then comes back with a smaller request that is more likely to be acceptable. Finally, that's not all, folks. This is when a product is offered at a certain price that may be high, but then the seller adds in something, a discount or a bonus product, to make it more appealing. Obedience is another type of social influence. This is behavior change done at the request of authority. You'll remember Milgram's experiment that we've studied about before, where participants were asked to inflict an increasingly high shock to another participant or a learner who was actually a Confederate. And this was to be done when that learner answered a question incorrectly. 65% of participants delivered the highest voltage, 450 volts, to the learners. Milgram identified 3 factors that are important in increasing or decreasing obedience. The authority figure is a factor. Milgram found that participants were more likely to obey commands when the experimenter appeared to be someone in authority, and this individual happened to have on a lab coat. The location that they did the experiment at was also well respected, Yale, but obedience dropped by 20% when the requester did not appear to be an authority figure. In other words, he appeared to be just an ordinary person, and then dropped 48% when the experiment location was in a less reputable area. Another factor in increasing and decreasing obedience, as determined by Milgram, is the proximity to the victim. This impacts the level of obedience. Milgram seated the learner in the same room as the participant. Only 40% fully obeyed the commands versus the original 65%. Obedience also dropped to 30% when the participant had to grasp the learner's hand. Finally, the procedure. How the procedure was carried out also impacted obedience and how much the participants would resist. Participants in the Milgram experiment were told that the experimenter was accountable. This relieved the participant of responsibility. They increased the shocks, and at some point, according to Milgram, they were swept up in situational momentum. They were in a situation they'd never experienced before, and they found it difficult to stop. Social impact theory was proposed by Bibb Latané in 1981 based on the belief that a common bond existed in the social influence processes. Social influence of any kind, according to Kaysen, Fine, and Marcus, depends on others' strength, immediacy, and number. Strength of a source is based on ability, status, or relationship. For example, making the targets feel obligated to reciprocate even a small favor. Wearing uniforms and showing authority would be a sign of strength. Immediacy, as I mentioned before in the Milgram experiment, is the proximity in time and space to the target. So the closer you are to the target, the greater the impact. And the number of sources. The more sources there are, the more influence to a point. And again, this is the same as we discussed earlier, where group size only minimally affects the influence past 3 or 4 others. So this is the same theory here. Groups. Groups are a set of individuals who directly interact with one another over a period of time and share a common fate, identity, or set of goals. People join groups to accomplish a goal, for self-esteem, or for a greater sense of purpose. Within groups, there are three different features. Roles, which is a set of expected behaviors. These can be formal or informal. There are two types of roles: instrumental roles, which helps the group achieve its task, and expressive roles, which provides emotional support. These can be the same or different individuals. Groups work better when the roles of their members match their talents and their personalities. Norms are the group expectations. They can be formal or informal. Problems can arise if groups deviate from the norm. In our study this week on the black sheep effect with college athletes and non-athletes, we discussed how group members display extreme negative judgments toward fellow group members who make the group look bad, and how common identity groups such as sports teams have stronger attachments to their groups than common bond groups do. Now, although the research did not find support for the black sheep effect that they described, it was interesting to me that in this sense, with group expectations, you do have problems when they start deviating from the group norms. And even if the problem is slight, it still exists. Finally, there's cohesiveness, and this occurs when group members share similarities and follow norms. Performance by groups can be impacted by several different things. There's process loss, which is the loss of group performance due to the dynamics of the group, and process gain, where groups perform better than the best individuals when the answer is evident and the work is divided within the group. We talked about brainstorming this week, the pros and cons of that, where sometimes brainstorming can produce production blocking or free writing or fear of being criticized for bringing up the idea. We discussed group polarization in our text this week, where groups can get together and have those individual opinions, which are all the same one, and when they get into the group, those initial opinions become extreme. Sometimes this can even lead to groupthink, where the need for concurrence outweighs the need for accurate information. So in other words, the group is not willing to consider any opinion contrary to that of the group. And the Challenger event and the Bay of Pigs were incidents that were used as the example. There are other ways, information sharing, which is a good thing and can cause process gain, but yet bias sampling is where groups may not know that individuals have information that they need to share. Groups may have members who have that knowledge that's unknown to the rest of the group, but due to the bias sampling, group members may only focus on the information that everyone already knows. All of this information sharing is better, though, when groups have a specific plan for when and how to review alternatives prior to making decisions. Dividing large amounts of information into smaller pieces or tasks that are shared amongst the members of the group is called transactive memory, and this helps groups in remembering more information than individuals. Having specific goals, again, increases group performance as well. This assists the group members in holding each other accountable and in encouraging each other. It's been very interesting learning about the social influences of conformity, compliance, obedience, discussing the social impact theory, and also group processes. And the references are shown here. Are as follows. Ephesians 4:15-16 states, "Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part of it working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love." Considering what we've learned about groups this week, what are some correlations you can make with this verse, especially as related to bias sampling and information sharing? And the second question is, describe a situation you've had where you can see that mindless compliance occurred. Thank you for listening.